Welcome to the Baptist Reformation, where we do the work of recovering the Reformation in Baptist thought. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Baptist Reformation, guys. I am going to give this to you as a bonus episode. This is a bonus episode of the Baptist Reformation podcast. It's only the second bonus episode we've ever done, so it's a big deal. Not really. I mean, this is a big topic that I'm going to be talking about today, and I don't want this to be a normal length episode because I don't want bonus episodes to be as long as the normal episodes. I don't know, kind of like an OCD type thing. I want to talk about an article written by Jim Cassidy on the Reformed Forum, and I interacted with him a little bit on Facebook, not really a whole lot actually. He only commented once on my article, or not on my article, but on my post about it. And I basically just quoted him, and it's an area. The quote is from an area where he was characterizing potentiality from the classical Christian theistic point of view, or the Thomist point of view, and so it's that paragraph is what I'm going to deal with. And the article is titled "The Essential Van Til," which is the series that this article is a part of. Aquinas and Barth, by that Karl Barth, their common core. And so he's trying to link Barth and Thomas together, and in light of Van Til's method. But this paragraph, the paragraph has some specific errors in it that I want to address. But I'm just going to read the paragraph, and then I'm going to talk about what the errors are, and I'm going to try to prayerfully, humbly answer those kind of errors. I want to correct them, if I may, Jim. I don't want to do this arrogantly. I don't want to be haughty, but I do think there's some errors in this paragraph. And because Reformed Forum is it's actually a podcast that I like to listen to sometimes. I'm not a fan of Van Tilianism. I'm not a fan of presuppositionalism anymore. I used to be. So I used to listen to Reformed Forum a lot more, but they still have some good stuff on there that I appreciate, especially when I'm trying to understand more of Van Til's thought. But this paragraph says this, and again, this is written by Jim Cassidy, or James J. Cassidy. And he says, we need to be brief here, admitting that this is not an exhaustive scope of an article by any means. We need to be brief here. A fuller scholarly treatment of this subject is beyond our purview. But the idea of potentiality entails what some call a chain or scale of being. Well, I'm going to stop there, because potentiality is not necessarily referred to as a scale of being. It is a distinction that we make, that contingent objects are potential in the sense that they have the potential to become that which they were not before. So that's what potentiality really is from a classical standpoint. From a Thomist standpoint, is the Thomists would say is that all contingent actualized objects have the potential to be that which they were not before, and they are actualized by something else. So a rubber ball, for example, melts if it's dropped into a skillet. So I can be a cause of that actualization of that potential to melt. So the rubber ball, as it is, has potential in it to melt, or to be melted. It also has the potential in it to be thrown or hurled across the field. It has the potential to be torn apart in two or into bits and pieces by a dog, so on and so forth. So these created objects that we have, daily reference to, we can think of as potential. And that's the idea of potentiality, is something moving, something being actualized, some things' potential being actualized. And that's what we mean by potential. So that's kind of examples of potentiality, or what we would mean by that. And so to think of it in terms of a scale of being is odd. He goes on to say, he says, potency is understood opposite of actuality. So is potency thought of, is that proper to say that the potency is thought of in terms of opposite of actuality? No. Opposite of actuality would actually be non-being. Potency is just it's a complementary term that we use for everything that's created, that's actual, is also potential. he goes on and he says, and everything has potency. Everything has potency, which by that I mean he implies that every created thing has potency, which means it has potential toward actualization. In other words, what he's saying is correct. It has the potential to be that which it is not currently. Only God is pure actuality, or actus purus, having no potency in himself. So God has no potency in himself. And what we mean by no potency, we mean he has no passive potency in himself. Active potency is a different discussion. What we mean by potency here is passive potency. Everything else is on its way toward actualization. And then he says, this idea is often connected with the idea of the analogia entis, or analogy of being. Things on the scale of being. God, who is the greatest being, man as an actualizing agent, relate to one another analogically. But they relate to one another analogically precisely because they're not on the same scale of being. Because there is a quantitative difference when we're talking about the existence of God and the existence of creatures. They don't exist in the same way, and so they can't be on the same scale of being. And so when we say God is greater, that's true in the sense that God is higher than we, but it's not true in the sense that God is just a more of a maximum creature than we are, on like a sliding scale of being. And so I think we have to be careful there. We have to not refer to God and man as being on the same scale of being. And so I think that language needs corrected. It needs specified or qualified more. He goes on, he says, while there is much dissimilarity between God and man, God is fully actualized. We are not. There is also a commonality as well. God and man are both beings. Okay, so let's stop there. Is God fully actualized? Well, if you mean that in the sense that God is actus purus, then I guess, but putting it in terms of fully actualized is speaking of God as if he's an object that has been actualized at some point in time in the past, or can be actualized, or that he at one time had some sort of passive potency in him that is now actual. And that's not how we should think of God either, because again, as Cassidy has already said, God is pure actuality. There's no passive potency in him to speak of. And so is there, the funny thing about this is that we make we make distinctions in our language, and you can talk about something univocally, and I talked about this in our Doctrine of God series, how I can talk about certain things univocally, where my terminology will grasp in a one-to-one correlative way something like this camera has a shiny lens, or this camera exists. And when we say those things about created objects, our language is more relative to those things that are creaturely. But when we talk about things analogically, we admit similitude, right? There's something there that's similar to us. Or to whatever we're describing, right? So to put this in terms of talking about God, in terms of our God speak, as Dr. James Dolezal puts it, when we talk about God and we say God knows something, okay, our language already there is improper, because we're predicating something about God, and to predicate something about God with creaturely language is always going to be improper. That's not to say it's going to be false or untrue, but it's going to be improper in the sense that it doesn't grasp what we're talking about when it comes to God. Okay, so God's knowledge, when we say God knows something, we don't mean that God knows something exactly how we have experience of people knowing something, or of any sentient agent knowing something, right? So God does not know like creatures know. He doesn't exist like creatures exist. There's this quantitative difference in our knowledge, in our existence, and so we have to predicate things about God analogically. It means that when we say God knows something, it means that we're admitting that in God there is something like knowledge, but it is not an exact replica of the knowledge that is in us, nor is it just a greater knowledge than humans, right? It is something that's altogether different, yet we can speak of it because that's how God has revealed himself to us. I think it was Charnock that says that God actually it was Turretin that said God has accommodated himself to us through his revelation. And so not even God's revelation is univocal about himself. It's analogical. He's stooping, so to speak, in his revelation so that we can understand what he's revealing to us. And so when the Bible, for example, uses language like God's nostrils, receiving the sweet-smelling aroma from sacrifices, or God's arm will accomplish his will, things of that nature, it obviously is not meant to say that God actually has an arm like we would understand him having an arm. It's analogical language communicating a truth about God using categories that we do have univocal knowledge of in our experience, but those experiential items that we actually have knowledge of do not apply right back onto God as they would apply to a dog or a cat or my wife or my son or any of my friends or anything like that. So that's kind of the idea of how we talk about God analogically. We don't talk about him univocally. And the problem I have with this paragraph is it seems to make somewhat of a distinction between analogical language, and actually in this article it seems to make a distinction between analogical language and what would assumedly be univocal language and equivocal language. But it's not holding up to it's not representing our view of classical theism in the context of a proper understanding of analogical language, right? So the paragraph almost sounds as if he's using univocal language to describe what we believe about analogical language, which doesn't really make sense to me. So like he says something like this, like, while there is much dissimilarity between God and man, God is fully actualized, we are not. Well, that's almost like univocal language. Like we're just drawing out differences between God and man now. Because remember, we're on the same scale of being. There's just differences. For example, God is more maximum than we are. He's a maximal being. We're not. And so he's at the top of the sliding scale, and we're somewhere in the middle, just above, livestock and apes and things like that. And then God is like at the top end, right? Well, the problem with that is that it puts God and man into this. They're just two different species of the same genus, right? They're in the same genus, as in they exist the same way at just two opposite ends of the spectrum, and that's not how classical Christian theism understands it. There's quantitative difference there, and so when he says like there's dissimilarities between God and man, and then there's similarities between God and man, already kind of making that distinction hard and fast, he's already assuming some sort of univocal language, as if God is just something greater that we can say, well, yeah, I have that different from God, but in common with God, I have, and he says here, I have being in common with God, right? Which, yes and no, and that's what you have to say when you talk about analogical language. If you mean common, as in there is something in God like being, or like we would understand being, or there is something in God like knowledge, or like will, or something of that nature that we would understand by virtue of our everyday experiences, yet it's not that kind of existence. It's not that kind of being. It's not that kind of knowledge or justice or will. The whatness is different. When we ask what of God, we're dealing with a different answer than when we ask what of creatures, okay? And that's where the quantitative distinction comes into play. And so already he's kind of assuming this univocal language, which is strange to me. But then he says, God and man are both beings. Well, in a very qualified sense. God is being. He's necessary being. We are not being. We are beings sustained by God, or brought to be by God and sustained by him. So we are not being, we are becoming, if anything. So we are brought to be and sustained by God. We're contingent, and God is necessary being. And so you see the totally different ways of existing there. God is necessary, creatures are contingent. And then he goes on, he says, so it is an analogy based on the fact of what God and man have in common, being. And that is false. The analogical language in classical Christian theism is based on the fact that God is quantitatively different than man. And that's why we have to use analogical language. And so it's not an analogy based on commonness or even based on similitude. It's based on the difference between God and man, and it's what we use in order to understand who God is at a creaturely level. And so when we say, for example, God is divinely simple, we cannot univocally talk about that. There is nothing we can compare that to from our everyday experience, because we live in a creaturely realm, and God does not live in that realm. And so there's this analogical language. We know we can use human language to correspond to God in some way, but it's analogical, because none of our language is going to directly correspond to an incomprehensible, divinely simple, self-existent, ase, necessary being. Okay? God is incommunicable in that respect. So then he ends, and he says, while God and man differ quantitatively in their being, they are not qualitatively different. And I just have to say that neither of those two words properly apply to God. Quantitative and qualitative differential would assume that God and man are on the same scale of being. But as I've discussed already, there's this quantitative difference. So I think the category he's lacking in this article is not quantitative, not qualitative, but quantitative. There's a quantitative difference. And so we're definitely not qualitatively the same as God. And he says here in their being, they are not qualitatively different. And that, to me, that actually really, I mean, when he said that, or when I read that in his article, I was really taken aback, because when you read Aquinas, he says things like this, answering the question whether names predicated of God are primarily predicated of creatures. He says, I answer that. In names predicated of many, in an analogical sense, all are predicated because they have reference to some one thing, and this one thing must be placed in the definition of them all. And since that expressed by the name is the definition, as the philosopher says, metaphor, such a name must be applied primarily to that which is put in the definition of such other things, and secondarily to these others according as they approach more or less to that first. Thus, for instance, healthy applied to animals comes into the definition of healthy applied to medicine, which is called healthy as being the cause of health in the animal, and also into the definition of healthy, which is applied to urine, which is called healthy insofar as it is the sign of the animal's health. Thus, all names applied metaphorically to God are applied to creatures primarily, rather to God, because when said of God, they mean only similitudes to such creatures. Okay? So when we say God is king, right? Say something like God is king, we are taking our human experience of what a king is, right? We're taking our understanding of a king, and we are using it to describe God. And so there's some quality in God that I don't want to say behaves, but that is revealed to us as being a king. So God is by his nature something like a king. He rules over creation, right? He's creator. He has dominion over all things, right? He sustains all things. We are like his serfs on his property, and he's sustaining us, right? In our daily living, even. Without him, we would not exist. And so there is something kingly in God. And so we use our experience of what a human king is, and we use that to describe God. That's analogical language. So God is not a human king, and that's not what we mean when we say God is king. We don't mean God is like, just another King Henry VIII or King George or something like that. We mean that there's something in God that is royal, right? That is like royalty. And you might say that that's his exclusivity, that's his primacy or something like that, supremacy, his sovereignty. Kings are sovereign over their territories and so on and so forth. But he is not an earthly king. He's not a creaturely king. When we say God knows, we're talking the same way. God doesn't know like we know. He knows in a single act. We don't know like that. Our knowledge progresses, we obtain knowledge, we act on our knowledge and things like that. And with that, I will go ahead and close out because we're over time. I didn't even want this to be as long as it is, but I hope this was beneficial. Jim Cassidy, I hope to interact with you more on this topic. Indeed, I hope to interact with Reformed Forum in general on this topic. I would love to open up a line of discussion. So God bless you guys. Have a good one.